In one black blizzard, 5 million tons of soil took to the air over Wichita, Kansas.
Living and breathing in that area was insufferable. There were a lot of cases of asthma, coughing fits, influenza, and dust pneumonia.
When dust buried the Great Plains and families lost everything, banks took away neighbors' homes, and dinner meant whatever's left in the pantry. Your grandmother was a genius who saved her family, and I'm going to show you exactly how she did it, using 30 forgotten tricks that still work today. You won't believe number 18, peanut shell coffee substitute. You didn't need real coffee to feel comfort, you just needed the ritual. During those lean Dust Bowl mornings when beans were too expensive and store shelves stayed bare, folks roasted peanut shells until they turned dark and brittle. Then ground them down and brewed them like coffee. You'd scoop the husks into a tin pot, pour boiling water over them, and let it steep until the kitchen smelled almost right. It didn't give you a caffeine kick, but it gave you something warm to hold. You'd cradle the mug with both hands, sip slow, and let the heat ease your chest. The taste wasn't coffee, not really. But if you closed your eyes, it was close enough. Earthy, toasty, and just bitter enough to trick your tongue. You'd add a splash of canned milk if you had it, maybe a sprinkle of sugar, but even plain, it filled the space where coffee used to live. You learned early, comfort was often more memory than flavor. This brew helped your family pretend things were normal, if only for a few quiet minutes before chores began, and when it ran out, you might steep the same batch again, just to stretch the warmth a little longer. Peanut shells? Someone might ask. Better than nothing, you'd say, and mean it, because back then, anything hot and brown in a cup was close enough to morning joy. Onion skin tea. You'd peel an onion for stew, toss the papery skins into the wood box, then pause, because in those days you didn't throw anything out that might still give something back. Those thin, crackly layers, they became tea, a tonic, really. You'd take a handful, rinse off the dust, and drop them into a saucepan of boiling water. The scent hit you sharp, earthy, and a little sweet, and you'd let it simmer until the water turned a soft amber. You'd strain it into a mug, maybe add honey or lemon if you had any, then sip it warm. Folks swore by it, said it eased coughs, calmed the chest, and kept colds at bay. Whether or not it cured anything didn't matter. It made you feel better. It meant you were still trying. The taste was mild, like a very weak broth, with a whisper of the onions you'd just saved for supper. But it was hot, and it was yours. That counted for something. You'd wrap your hands around the cup and take it slow, letting the warmth work its way down. Your mama might say, "It's got minerals," and maybe it did. Or maybe it was just another trick to make something out of nothing. "You're drinking onion peels?" someone might say, and you'd answer, "They've still got a little life in them," because they did. So did you. Water pie. You probably wouldn't believe it unless you'd seen it set in the pan yourself, but yes, people made pie out of water. When eggs were gone, butter was rare, and fruit was just a memory. Folks still found a way to make dessert. You'd pour plain water right into a pie crust, sprinkle in sugar and flour, and drop in a bit of vanilla or butter flavor if you had any left. Then came the hardest part, waiting while it baked. The smell wasn't strong, but the hope was. You'd peek through the oven door, watching the clear filling bubble and thicken like magic. Somehow that sugar water mixture turned into a kind of soft jelly, not quite pudding, not quite custard, but sweet, warm, and solid enough to slice. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't even pretty, but it was dessert. And during the Dust Bowl, dessert meant something was going right. You might dust the top with cinnamon, serve it warm or cold, maybe with a dollop of canned milk if you were lucky. It wasn't about taste, though it tasted fine. It was about effort, about proving you could still make something special from almost nothing at all. Burnt toast charcoal cure. When someone complained of a sour stomach, folks didn't reach for a bottle of pink liquid. They reached for the toaster, or more likely, a cast-iron skillet, and burned a slice of bread until it was black as coal. Then they'd scrape off the loose bits, crumble the rest, and mix it into warm water or milk. That's how burnt toast became medicine. It sounds strange now, but back then, people knew charcoal absorbed toxins. They might not have had fancy labels or scientific proof, but they had proof enough. It worked. You'd sip that gritty mixture slowly, nose wrinkled, hoping for relief. And often, you got it. The taste? Like chewing on a campfire. But when your belly was twisted in knots from old canned food or undercooked meat, you weren't picky. You learned from your elders. You listened when someone said, "Burn it good," almost to ash, because they'd been there, done that, and knew what saved them once might save you now. Kids made faces. Adults took it serious. It was part of the home remedy toolkit, like mustard plasters, turpentine rubs, and onion poultices. You didn't question it. You just made it, drank it, and hoped it worked. Boiled newspaper soup thickener. You'd never dream of doing it today, but back then, when hunger outweighed pride and the pantry was nothing but shadows, folks boiled newspaper, not to eat the paper itself, but to make a pot of soup feel like it had something in it. You'd tear old newsprint into strips, toss it into a boiling pot of water and bones, and wait for it to break down. The ink ran, the pages softened, and the broth turned thick, murky, and just full enough to trick your stomach. Was it safe? Who knew? But it was warm. It filled the belly. And when you watched your child sip it without complaint, that was all the answer you needed. You didn't tell company what you used. You didn't have to. Everyone knew times were hard. It wasn't about taste. It was about survival. You might throw in a carrot peel, a potato eye, or the stem of a cabbage leaf. And if you were lucky enough to have a bit of lard or marrow, that soup became a meal. You're boiling paper? Someone might ask, eyes wide. You'd shrug. It thickens it nice. And in a world where flour was gone and cornstarch was a luxury, newspaper thickened more than soup. It thickened your skin, taught you what it meant to swallow pride, and keep going. But there were other recipes, too, ones that didn't rely on tricks, just hot water, cornmeal, and a frying pan. And they fed folks across the South, storm or no storm. Hot water cornbread. You didn't need eggs. You didn't need milk. You didn't even need a measuring cup. If you had cornmeal and boiling water, you had supper. Hot water cornbread wasn't just food. It was memory, warmth, and sound. That sizzle when the batter hit the skillet was the music of survival. You'd boil water on the stove, pour it into a bowl of dry cornmeal, and stir with a fork until it clumped just right. Not too thick, not too runny. You shaped it by hand, little patties or oval lumps, then dropped them into hot bacon grease or lard. The smell alone could bring the whole family into the kitchen. The outside crisped up golden, the inside stayed soft and steaming. Some folks ate it plain, others dipped it in syrup or used it to sop up beans, stew, or pot liquor. It didn't matter what was on the plate. Hot water. Cornbread made it better. It was cheap, it was fast, it made noise when you chewed it, and it tasted like home, even when everything else felt like it was falling apart. "Mama, how'd you make this?" you might ask. She'd smile, not even looking up. "Same way Grandma did, just cornmeal and hot water, baby." Because that's all it took. No oven, no milk, no fuss. And while it sizzled in the pan, you were already thinking about tomorrow's breakfast and whether you could stretch a single can of soup into something sweet enough for cake. Sour milk biscuits. You'd think spoiled milk meant it was time to throw it out, but back then, when food was too precious to waste, sour milk was a gift, especially when biscuit day came around. You didn't call it expired. You called it just right. You'd mix it with flour, a little baking soda, and lard if you had it. Stir until sticky. Drop it in rough blobs on a greased pan or iron skillet. No cutters, no rolling, just a spoon or your hand. The sour milk worked like magic, reacting with the soda to puff them up light, soft, and full of tiny bubbles. They weren't sweet, but they had a tang, a flavor that made you raise your eyebrows, smile, and reach for another. You'd split one open with your fingers, steam rising, and spread a dab of jam or bacon grease if you had any. Even the smell was different, sharp, warm, like something between bread and cheese. It filled the kitchen and told everyone, something special's in the oven today. Is that real buttermilk? Someone might ask. You'd grin. Close enough. Because these weren't throwaway biscuits. These were survival biscuits, born from milk that turned, flour that stretched, and hands that knew how to make do. And when the milk jug was empty and all that was left was a sack of skins from yesterday's potatoes, you didn't despair. You made broth, and it warmed your bones. Potato peel broth. Every peel counted. When potatoes were precious, you never tossed the skins. You saved them, every strip, every curl, and made soup out of what most folks would throw away. You'd rinse them clean, just in case. Then boil them down in a big pot of water with a pinch of salt. Maybe toss in an onion end, a garlic clove, or a dried herb if you had it. But mostly, it was peels, rough and curled, full of starch and scraps of flesh, transforming plain water into something warm and rich. The broth turned cloudy, then golden. It didn't smell like much at first, but give it time. It developed depth. You'd sip it straight or pour it over stale bread, maybe float a dumpling if the flour bin wasn't empty. Kids didn't know the difference. Adults called it potato soup and left it at that. The truth was, it was peel soup, but it worked. That's just scraps, someone might say. And you'd nod, spoon in hand. Yep, that's supper. Because nutrition didn't have to be fancy. It just had to be hot, clean, and made with care. You'd sit by the stove, cradling your cup like it was something grand, and as that broth warmed your chest, you were already wondering if the next night's bread could rise without yeast, just a bit of air, a warm towel, and maybe a prayer. Sweet potato peel pancakes. You'd already scraped the sweet potatoes clean, boiled the flesh, maybe mashed it with lard for dinner. But the peels? You saved those too, because in the South, especially when money vanished, even the skins were breakfast. You'd rinse them, chop them fine, and mix them with a little flour and water, maybe add a pinch of salt, a sprinkle of sugar if there was any to spare. If an egg was available, it went in. If not, you made do. The batter was loose, lumpy, and a little strange-looking, but you didn't mind. Into the hot skillet it went, spattering as it hit the leftover bacon grease. You'd flatten each scoop with a fork, then wait for the edges to crisp and the middle to hold together. Flip, fry stack. The result wasn't pretty, but it smelled sweet and earthy, like something warm and worth remembering. The taste, like a hush puppy married a hash brown, crispy outside, soft and slightly sweet inside. Kids ate 'em up before they cooled. Adults spread apple butter on top or drizzled syrup if they'd managed to save some from ration stamps. You made these from peels? Someone would ask, stunned. You'd nod, smiling. Nothing wasted, because during the Dust Bowl, that was the rule. If you peeled it, you ate it. And just when the kitchen felt empty again, someone came in from the garden with a bowl full of backyard lettuce, not to serve cold, but to pour hot bacon grease right over the top. Wilted lettuce salad with hot bacon dressing. The lettuce was fresh-picked, soft, and fading fast in the summer heat. That's when you moved quick, because this wasn't the kind of salad you served cold. This was a Depression-era secret, something you could make with bacon grease, vinegar, and a bit of sugar that transformed tired greens into a Sunday side dish. You'd tear the lettuce by hand, no fancy knives, no fuss, and drop it into a big bowl. Then you'd heat up a skillet with saved bacon fat, a spoonful of vinegar, a little water, and a pinch of sugar. Maybe an onion slice if it hadn't gone soft. When the mixture sizzled, you poured it straight over the greens. They hissed, they softened. And suddenly your kitchen smelled like a mix of breakfast and garden soil. The lettuce wilted just enough, not soggy, just tender. You'd toss it gently, serve it warm, maybe add a chopped hard-boiled egg if you were lucky that week. It tasted sweet, salty, tangy, like it came from a proper restaurant, not from a backyard and a coffee tin full of drippings. This salad's hot, someone might say, eyebrow raised. You'd grin. It's not just salad, it's supper. Because when meat was scarce and lettuce wouldn't last another day, this warm, wilting bowl brought comfort that couldn't be canned. Apple peel vinegar. You didn't throw out apple peels back then, not a single one. After pie making or drying apple slices, folks gathered up the peels and cores in a jar, covered them with water, and added a spoonful of sugar. That's it. No store-bought yeast, no fancy bottles, just scraps, time, and a little kitchen faith. You'd set that jar near a warm window and wait. A few days in, the sweet smell turned sharp. A week later, it was tart enough to pucker your lips. By the time it hit 3 weeks, you had full-blown vinegar, strong, cloudy, and alive with tang. That vinegar was worth gold. You used it in pickles, poured it over cooked greens, or mixed it into cold slaw. Some even used it for cleaning. It made everything feel fresher, cleaner, brighter, a sharp splash that cut through the heaviness of fried foods and oily dressings. If you had a cough or sore throat, a spoonful of apple vinegar in hot water was a go-to remedy. Mixed with honey, it became a tonic. Added to biscuits or pie crust, it made them flakier. There wasn't a scrap of that vinegar that went to waste. It's just peels, someone might say, and you'd smile, because that's all it ever was. Peels, cores, water, sugar. But the outcome? Useful, lasting, and full of punch. Apple vinegar didn't just stretch your pantry. It stretched your sense of control. Even when money was gone and shelves were bare, this sharp little miracle reminded you nothing was useless, just like stale bread, which turned from rock-hard waste into the secret that saved nearly every meat dinner you served next. Breadcrumb meat stretchers. When meat was precious, you didn't cook it straight. You stretched it. You made it count. And the trick most mothers knew by heart? Breadcrumbs. They'd take stale bread, the kind so hard you could knock on it, and soak it in milk or water just long enough to soften, then squeeze it dry, crumble it with your fingers, and mix it straight into ground beef or pork. What came out wasn't less meaty, it was better. Meatloaf, meatballs, sausage patties, all got lighter, juicier, and more flavorful. The crumbs soaked up fat and seasoning, held everything together, and made that single pound of meat feed twice as many mouths. In homes with 6 kids and 1 paycheck, this wasn't a tip, it was a rule. Some added chopped onions, mustard, or eggs. Others used dried herbs or leftover mashed potatoes to bulk it even further. But always, the core was the bread. Meat again? A kid might ask, and Mama would grin. Sure is. They didn't know how much bread was in there. They just tasted something warm, filling, and familiar. It wasn't a feast, but it felt like one. Even the hard edges of the bread, usually tossed, were ground fine and saved in a tin. Used to coat fried foods or bind salmon patties, those crumbs made everything stick and stretch. Breadcrumbs weren't just a meat stretcher, they were the invisible helper. The quiet secret that made every Depression-era dinner go a little further without ever feeling short. And when bread ran out too, that's when the hacks got real desperate, like boiling newspaper just to thicken soup and make it feel like a meal. Lard jar biscuits. Back then, you didn't toss bacon grease. You saved it, every drop. Sitting on the stove was a tin can, sometimes an old coffee tin, filled with hardened, cloudy lard scraped from the skillet after every fry. It wasn't pretty. It didn't smell sweet, but it was gold. When it came time to bake, you'd scoop from that jar with a big spoon. No measuring, just enough. The lard was soft in summer, stiff as butter in winter. You'd cut it into flour with your hands, cool and crumbly, until the dough held together with just a splash of water or sour milk. Those biscuits didn't rise tall and fluffy like the ones in cookbooks. They were wide, sturdy, golden on the bottom, and greasy in a way that made your lips shine. The kitchen filled with the smell of smoke and warmth, like bacon and fresh bread holding hands. You'd serve them hot right out of the oven. No butter needed. The fat was baked in. Sometimes you'd split one and stuff it with sliced tomato or scrambled egg. Other times it was just biscuit and hot coffee, enough to count as breakfast, lunch, or even a quick supper. This from scratch? Someone might ask. You'd just nod. Because the truth was, it wasn't really from scratch. It was built from what you'd already used. Fat from Sunday's breakfast, flour from a sack you hoped would last the month, and scraps of know-how passed down by mothers who never owned a cookbook. And when those biscuits were gone and the coffee pot was empty, you didn't toss that water either. You reused it 3 ways, because back then even boiled water had work left to do. Leftover water reuse map. Water wasn't just water. It was a tool, a worker, a silent part of every meal. You boiled it once and used it 3 times, not because it was smart, but because it was survival. Let's say you boiled potatoes. When the spuds were done and scooped out, that water, cloudy and starchy, didn't go down the drain. You poured it into a jar, set it on the counter, and later that night added it to soup. It thickened the broth, added salt, and gave the stew a body that plain water couldn't touch. If you didn't use it for food, it became wash water, greasy pots, sticky spoons, whatever needed cleaning. The starch in the water helped lift grime. Hot, reused water felt just as useful as fresh, especially when you only had a few buckets a day from the well. And if there was still some left after dishes, you carried that pot outside and poured it under the tomatoes or along the rows of beans. The plants didn't care where it came from. They just needed moisture. This water's been everywhere, you might joke, and it had. From food to cleanup to garden. A single pot did 3 jobs. No waste, no second thoughts. Even the act of saving it felt like a small victory. In a world where every drop mattered, every use felt like stretching time, money, and luck just a little further. Kids learned early. You don't dump water, you wait, you repurpose, you give it one more task. And when even water ran low, when wells dried and rain didn't come, folks turned to tricks like onion peel tea and roasted peanut shells, not to waste time, but to keep something warm in their hands and hope in their bellies. Oatmeal sausage. You wanted meat, but there wasn't any. Not in the icebox, not at the butcher's, not anywhere. So you did what every smart cook did. You made your own. Not from pork, but from oats. You'd take old-fashioned rolled oats and boil them just enough to soften. Then, the trick, seasoning. A heavy hand of salt, pepper, maybe a pinch of sage or red pepper flakes if your spice tin still rattled. Some even stirred in mashed beans or leftover mashed potatoes for texture. You'd mix it all together in a bowl that smelled almost like breakfast, almost like dinner. Then came the shaping. Wet hands, hot pan. You'd form the mixture into patties, fry them in bacon grease or lard until the outside turned golden and crisp. The edges sizzled and curled like sausage. The smell, nutty and rich, tricked your nose into believing. You'd serve it hot, maybe with a spoonful of canned apples or a smear of mustard if you had it. Cut it open and steam rose. The inside was soft, almost creamy. But the flavor? That punch of pepper and smoke made you forget there wasn't a scrap of meat inside. "Is this sausage?" someone might ask, fork in hand. You'd smile. Close enough, and it was. Because back then, dinner wasn't about what you had. It was about what you could make with what you had left. These oat patties stretched $1, fed a family, gave tired hands something to cook, and hungry mouths something warm to chew. And when you didn't even have oats, just a few stray ketchup packets and some hot water, you still found a way to make supper. Ketchup soup. You ever make dinner out of a handful of ketchup packets? You would have if your belly was growling and there wasn't a penny to spare. This wasn't fancy soup. It wasn't even real soup. Not really. But it was hot, red, and it filled a bowl. That counted. You'd take a kettle of boiling water and stir in a few squeezes of ketchup, whatever was left from a diner visit or scraped from the bottom of a bottle. Add a pinch of salt, a dash of pepper, maybe a crumble of stale cracker or a spoon of dried onion if you had it. And just like that, you had dinner. It wasn't thick, it wasn't rich, but it was warm and red and made your insides stop aching for a little while. "Mama, what is this?" a kid might ask, holding the chipped bowl close. "It's tomato broth," you'd say, giving it a name that sounded real, giving it a name that made it okay. They'd sip it slow and maybe laugh at the tang, maybe wrinkle their nose, but they'd eat it because that's what you did when times got tight. You turned scraps into meals and shame into pride. It was survival in a spoon, and somehow it still tasted like hope. You learned that hunger had a sound, but so did boiling water. And in those kitchens where empty shelves stared back at you, ketchup soup reminded you that even a condiment could be a lifeline. And when the soup was gone, and the kettle still had heat, you might make a second cup, this time from something unexpected, like steeped onion skins or potato peels, because in those days nothing was trash, not even a splash of ketchup. Vinegar poached eggs. You didn't need oil to make breakfast, just vinegar and water. Back then, fat was gold, and eggs were treasure. But if you knew what you were doing, you could poach an egg in vinegar and still get something that looked like Sunday brunch. You'd bring a small pot of water to a soft boil, just a few inches deep. Then you'd splash in vinegar, the kind that made your nose sting a little. White vinegar was best, but apple cider worked too. It made the water cloudy and sharp, but that's what helped the egg hold together. You'd crack one egg, just one, into a small cup, then lower it into the swirling water. The vinegar curled the whites fast, kept the egg neat like a little bundle. No oil, no butter, just patience and practice. 2, maybe 3 minutes later, you'd lift it out with a slotted spoon. The yolk jiggled gently, the whites firm but soft. You'd lay it over toast or grits, maybe sprinkle a pinch of salt if you had it. That egg, cooked without fat, still had richness, still tasted like something special. Kids called it sour eggs. Some liked the tang, others didn't, but everyone ate it. "Why's it taste funny?" a child might ask. You'd smile. "That's just the vinegar hugging it." And they'd grin too, because food cooked with care always tasted better, even if it was odd. Vinegar didn't just poach, it preserved. If eggs were too many and the icebox was too warm, you could soak them in vinegar and keep them from going bad for days. A trick passed down from your mother, and hers before that. And when the food was gone, and your toothbrush bristles wore thin, you turned to something even older, the fireplace. Ash lye toothpaste. You didn't throw away ash. Not from the stove, not from the fireplace. That stuff was useful for cleaning, for curing, and, believe it or not, for brushing your teeth. Toothpaste? That was a luxury. Store-bought, sweet-smelling, full of things you couldn't pronounce. But you didn't need it, not when you had salt, wood ash, and grit. You'd scoop a bit of clean ash from the back of the stove, not the sooty black kind, but the fine, soft gray powder left after hardwood burned hot and slow. You'd mix it with a pinch of salt and just enough water to make a paste. Gritty, chalky, bitter, but strong. Rubbed onto your teeth with a cloth, or an old brush if you had one, it scrubbed away grime and freshened your breath. Sort of. The salt cleaned, the ash neutralized. It wasn't minty, but it worked. "Is this safe?" someone might ask, eyebrow raised, and you'd say what your grandma said, "Better than nothing and better than rot." Kids squirmed at the taste, but learned to live with it. It became routine, a part of morning chores, a reminder that you could still take care of yourself even when money was gone and soap was scarce. Ash had other uses, too. It cleaned cast iron, kept bugs out of the garden, even made lye soap when boiled down right. But in the bathroom, it became a badge of survival. You learned to smile without shame, because that chalky gray meant you hadn't given up. And after scrubbing with ash and salt, you might just boil onion skins into tea, a dusty brown broth that warmed the chest and soothed a stubborn cough. Because in the Dust Bowl, even your fireplace helped keep your family going. Newspaper pan liners. You didn't waste grease, not even for cake. When baking pans were too sticky and butter too precious, you turned to something nobody wanted: yesterday's newspaper. A soggy sheet of newsprint could save your whole cake. You'd tear a page from the paper, not the comics, not obituaries, but something in between, and dampen it under the pump or kitchen spigot, not soaked, just softened. You'd lay it in the bottom of your baking tin, pressing it smooth with your knuckles. Then in went the batter. Maybe vinegar cake, maybe water pie. The paper kept the cake from sticking, just like parchment. It browned the bottom, held moisture in, and peeled right off once the cake was done. You didn't need butter. You didn't need flour. You just needed a steady hand and a scrap of something printed. "Won't the ink ruin it?" someone would ask. "Nope," you'd say, slicing the cooled cake with a butter knife. "It bakes clean." The scent of warm cake filled the room, and no one noticed a thing. You'd shake the paper out, toss it in the stove, and wipe the pan with a cloth. Kids licked the crumbs from their fingers, never knowing how close you'd come to skipping dessert altogether. And when that same pan had to hold stew the next day, you gave it a good scrub, not with soap, not with steel wool, but with meat. Salt pork soap scrub. Before salt pork hit the skillet, it cleaned it first. Sounds strange? Maybe. But during the Dust Bowl, even a slab of meat had more than one job to do. You'd take a chunk of fatback, cured pork belly packed in salt, and hold it like a bar of soap. The grease was thick, the surface gritty. You'd scrub the bottom of the cast-iron skillet with it, loosening the black crust from yesterday's cornbread or fried mush. The salt acted like an abrasive. The fat softened what was stuck. With a little elbow grease and maybe a splash of hot water, the pan came clean without a drop of real soap. Then, without hesitation, you'd rinse that same piece of pork, pat it dry, and drop it into the stew pot. Waste not. The flavor was still there, and nobody minded. "Mama, didn't you use that to clean the pan?" one kid might ask. You'd just smile. That's how you season it, and you weren't wrong. Salt pork brought depth to beans, lent chew to cabbage, gave biscuits a crackly edge when chopped fine and fried in the pan first. But before all that, it kept your skillet shining. You didn't have Brillo. You didn't have Dawn, but you had lard and grit and know-how. That hunk of meat was part food, part soap, part secret. Just like everything else in a Dust Bowl kitchen, it worked triple time to keep the family fed. And when even salt pork was gone and the cupboard echoing, you reached for something wild, like dandelion greens from the back pasture. Corn cob jelly. You wouldn't think a leftover corn cob could turn into anything sweet, but your grandma did. She didn't throw them out, she boiled them. And what came out of that pot wasn't just pale yellow jelly. It was sunshine, sealed in a jar. After dinner, once the corn was scraped and the butter dish wiped clean, those bare cobs were saved in a bowl beside the sink. Not because anyone told them to, because wasting them felt wrong. Come morning, she'd drop a few into a pot of water, bring it to a boil, then let it simmer low and slow until the liquid turned golden and smelled faintly of roasted corn and summer fields. She'd strain the liquid through cheesecloth, stir in sugar and a packet of powdered pectin, and boil it again. As the bubbles rolled, the kitchen filled with a scent that made you pause. Part corn, part caramel, part memory. It was the kind of smell that lingered in your clothes and clung to the walls long after the jars were sealed. And that color, not quite yellow, not quite amber, glowed like morning light. Poured over hot biscuits, it looked like store-bought honey, but sweeter, smoother, like something made by hand and heart, not machine. They didn't call it corn cob jelly to be clever. They called it that because there wasn't another word for the magic of turning nothing into something. No corn, no problem. The flavor lived in the cob, and if you added a splash of lemon juice or a cinnamon stick, it tasted like a luxury you didn't have to explain. One man from Kansas said, "We didn't have money, but our shelves were golden." And he meant it. Next time someone tosses a cob, you'll remember this, and maybe set it aside, because your grandmother didn't just make jelly, she preserved dignity. And speaking of preserving dignity, wait till you see what she did with dandelions. Dandelion syrup. Most folks cursed dandelions. Your grandma blessed them. While neighbors mowed them down, she picked them in a flour sack, smiling as if she were gathering gold. To her, those bright yellow weeds weren't a nuisance. They were breakfast. She'd wake early, before the heat rolled in, and walk barefoot through the yard, plucking only the brightest blooms. No stems, no green, just the petals, soft and sunshine-colored, stuffed into a chipped enamel bowl. Then she'd rinse them, strain them, and drop them into a pot with lemon slices and water. The petals boiled down slowly, their color fading into the water like tea. Then came the sugar. Stirred gently, patiently. The mix simmered and thickened, and the kitchen started to smell like lemonade and wildflowers. What she poured into jars looked like honey, but tasted gentler. Floral, light, with a lemony brightness that danced on your tongue. She'd spoon it over cornbread or drizzle it into tea. Kids thought it was real honey. Grown-ups knew better, but no one complained, because when sugar was scarce and syrup was a dream, this was what you made. A sweet from weeds, a treat from a field most people ignored, and the best part? It didn't cost a penny. People laughed at us, one woman recalled, but when their cupboards were bare, they came asking for a jar. Dandelion syrup wasn't about survival. It was about seeing beauty in the unwanted, the overlooked, the wild. Your grandma didn't need a garden to make something good. She just needed a weed, some lemon, and time. And just wait, the next dish didn't even need sugar or petals. It needed nothing but a hot oven and water. Mock apple pie, no apples. You wouldn't believe it unless you tasted it yourself. A pie made with no apples, no orchard, no fruit at all. Just Ritz crackers, lemon, sugar, and a whole lot of Depression-era grit. But when you closed your eyes and took that first bite, your tongue swore there were apples inside. It started with a box of crackers, crumbled just right and dropped into a pie shell like they were golden slices from a tree. Then came the magic. Lemon juice, sugar, cinnamon, and a splash of vanilla, all simmered into a syrup that softened the crackers until they puffed and soaked up the sweetness. You'd cover it all with a second layer of crust, lard-based maybe, or just flour and water pressed thin and patched by hand. Then bake it until the top browned and bubbled. The smell filled the whole house, warm and familiar. Apple pie? Not quite. But your memory couldn't tell the difference. Kids never knew the trick. They ate it with their mouths full and eyes wide, nodding like it was the best pie they'd ever had. And maybe it was, because the real flavor wasn't in the fruit. It was in the idea that something ordinary could taste like something special, that even when orchards failed and stores ran dry, you could still serve a slice of something that felt like home. You'd slice it warm and serve it with a little evaporated milk, or nothing at all. The crust cracked just right, and the insides shimmered like candied apples. It was sleight-of-hand baking, and it worked. "More pie?" someone might ask, fork already halfway up. "Only if you guess what's inside," you'd grin. And just down the counter, in the 1930s, bakers with empty fruit bowls found a wild solution in their cracker tins. Mock apple pie was born, made not from fruit, but from Ritz crackers, sugar, and a little bit of lemon. It started with a plain pie crust, rolled thin and laid into a tin. Then came the filling. Broken crackers, stacked like apple slices, layered with a syrup made from sugar, water, lemon juice, and cinnamon. Once baked, the crackers softened, puffed slightly, and took on the same bite and texture as cooked apples. It fooled nearly everyone. The smell was sweet and warm, like a proper holiday pie. The crust browned, the filling bubbled, and when you sliced it, you saw layers that looked just right. Some added a pinch of cream of tartar to mimic the tartness of Granny Smith's. Others dropped a pat of butter on top for richness. You'd serve it warm, maybe with whipped milk or a spoon of canned cream if you had any. And the first bite? Sweet, soft, spiced, and just chewy enough to make you believe it came off a tree. It became a point of pride. "Try it and tell me that's not apple," folks would say. And more often than not, they were right. Mock apple pie didn't just stretch ingredients. It stretched imagination. It reminded families that even without fresh fruit, you could still serve something that felt like celebration. Something else glistened, orange and gold, but not from any fruit you'd expect. Carrot marmalade. Oranges were for the lucky ones, or the city folks. But out here, you reached for something cheaper and brighter, carrots. And from those humble roots, you made marmalade. It started with grating. You'd sit at the kitchen table with a tin grater in your lap, shredding carrots into fine, soft piles. The orange bits fell like confetti onto an old plate, ready to be transformed. You'd boil them with water and sugar, just enough to coat, never enough to waste. Then add lemon zest, maybe a spoonful of juice, sometimes a touch of ginger or cinnamon. The pot bubbled low and slow on the stove, sending up sweet steam that smelled like orange candy, even if no orange had ever touched the mix. The sugar thickened, the color deepened, and when it cooled, it spread golden across biscuits like sunshine in a jar. It fooled the eyes and satisfied the mouth. Your kids called it citrus jam. You never corrected them. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't store-bought, but it was yours, made from what you had, not what you wished for. You kept it in reused glass jars with wax seals, labeled it with tape or grease pencil, and when the pantry felt too quiet, that bright little jar reminded you. The earth still gave, even when times didn't. "This is carrot?" a neighbor might ask, licking a dab off their thumb. "Better than orange," you'd wink. And when you ran out of sugar but still had petals in bloom, you didn't stop. You went outside and picked your syrup straight from the yard. Bacon grease cookies. You scraped the last bit of drippings from the tin on the back of the stove, the one with a lid that never quite fit, where all the bacon grease pooled after breakfast. Back then, nothing was wasted, not even grease, especially not grease. And so you made cookies. You didn't have butter. Hardly anyone did. But bacon grease? That you had. Saved it from every pan, strained it through cheesecloth, let it cool into a creamy white slab, then scooped it by the spoonful into a bowl with sugar, flour, and just enough baking soda to lift it. If you had an egg, you used it. If not, you didn't. Vanilla was optional. A pinch of salt, that depended on how salty your bacon was. You'd roll the dough by hand, soft and a little sticky, and press it flat on an old cookie sheet lined with brown paper or reused wax wrap. Into the oven they went, the heat pulling up the smell of breakfast and dessert at the same time, a little smoky, a little sweet. When they came out, they were golden around the edges, soft in the center. The first bite surprised you. Not savory, not meaty, just rich, deep, with a hint of salt that made the sugar pop. Kids loved them. Adults understood them. They were a statement. We can still have joy, even when it tastes a little like yesterday's breakfast. They kept well in tins, layered with newspaper or a scrap of cloth. And when guests came by, rare as they were, you offered them proudly, because you made them. You didn't need butter. You needed grit and a spoonful of grease. You made these with bacon fat? Someone might ask. And you'd smile, just a little. Sure did. And while the cookies cooled, simple cookies made with molasses, flour, and whatever spices were available, these treats were soft, chewy, and not too sweet for young palates. Molasses was cheaper than sugar and added iron and other minerals to children's diets, making these cookies feel like medicine that actually tasted good. The cookies were dark and mysterious looking, which appealed to children's sense of adventure, but mild and familiar tasting. which satisfied their need for comfort. The kettle boiled, time for coffee or something close to it. Coffee grounds grits. You used the grounds once, poured hot water through them slow, and drank the bitter brew in silence. Then, instead of tossing them, you saved the damp clumps in a dish on the stove because the day wasn't over, and those grounds still had work to do. Next came the grits, not creamy, not cheesy, just plain cornmeal, boiled in salted water until it thickened into a soft, pale mound. Filling, yes, but flavorless, so you stirred in the used coffee grounds, just a little at first, then more. The smell changed, richer, earthier, the color darkened, like wet soil after rain. The grits thickened even more, the bitterness cutting through the bland starch and giving it depth. Warm, smoky, and strange. You didn't eat it with sugar. You ate it with a spoon and a quiet nod, because it filled your belly, and that was enough. This was survival food, fuel. It wasn't supposed to taste like a cafe. It was supposed to keep you moving, and it did. One old man called it mud porridge. Kids called it grumpy breakfast, but every bowl got cleaned. Still bitter, someone might ask, spooning it slow. Still working, you'd say. And before the kettle cooled, you were boiling something new, with no fruit, no filling, just memories and make-do sweetness. Vinegar disinfectant spray. You didn't have Lysol, you barely had soap, but you had vinegar, and somehow that sharp little bottle did the job. It sat on the windowsill, cloudy with age, crusted at the rim, catching the sunlight like it held something sacred. Inside was a homemade potion, vinegar steeped with herbs you pulled from the yard or borrowed from the neighbor's patch. Mint, thyme, a sprig of rosemary if the summer hadn't burned it dry. No labels, no brand, just something your mother swore by, and her mother before her. You'd boil the herbs first, letting the steam fill the kitchen with the smell of green things, then pour it into the vinegar bottle and let it sit for days. The longer it sat, the stronger it got. Sharp, pungent, but clean. And back then, clean didn't mean shiny. It meant safe. You didn't need a plastic spray bottle. You used what you had. An old soda bottle with a nail-punched cap, a chipped cup, and a rag. A tin sprayer, if you were lucky. That vinegar wiped down the cutting board before dinner and the table after. It cleaned doorknobs, lunch pails, buckets, and anything that looked like it might carry a cold. You sprayed it on apples before slicing and rubbed it onto a wooden spoon after stirring stew. When someone in the house started sniffling, you made another batch, stronger this time. You'd steep extra herbs and maybe add salt or lemon peel if there was any. You wiped every corner, every handle, even the edge of the stove. Kids hated the smell. They'd crinkle their noses and complain, "It stinks in here, Ma," and you'd smile, wiping again. "Smells like we're not getting sick." Because vinegar was cheap. It didn't spoil. It didn't need a label. And in a time when doctors were far away and medicine cost more than groceries, that bottle was your best defense. You didn't need bleach to feel like you were protecting your family. You just needed something strong enough to bite back at germs, something you made with your own two hands. Neighbors would knock, asking for a bit. "You still got some of that vinegar mix?" they'd say, and you'd pour them a jar. No questions asked. It wasn't about sparkle. It wasn't about shine. It was about doing something when everything else felt out of your control. And when the floor was clean, the windows wiped, and every surface had that vinegar bite to it, you'd finally sit. Pour yourself a cup of something hot. Wrap your hands around it and feel, for just a moment, like the storm outside couldn't touch the safety inside. Even now, that smell might take you back to linoleum floors, to a kitchen scrubbed clean, to a house that didn't have much, but still had rules, still had order, still had pride. Because in the Dust Bowl days, disinfectant didn't come from a store. It came from a jar on your windowsill, brewed by hand and backed by love, and maybe that's why it worked. Boiled egg coffee hack. It wasn't fancy, it wasn't normal, but it worked. And if you've ever tasted gritty, bitter coffee that made your mouth curl, you might understand why someone would crack a raw egg straight into the pot. During the Dust Bowl, coffee wasn't just a luxury, it was a ritual, a lifeline, and sometimes the only comfort a person had all day. But fresh beans were rare, filters were expensive, and cream, that was for the rich. So folks got clever, really clever. You'd start with whatever coffee you had, sometimes old grounds that had already been brewed once. Dump it into a dented kettle kettle or tin pot. Then came the strange part, one raw egg, shell and all. You'd crack it gently, letting the white and yolk slide into the mix, then crumble in the crushed shell right behind it. It looked like a mess. But once that pot hit the fire and started to boil, something amazing happened. The heat caused the egg white to cook, and as it did, it latched onto the floating coffee grounds, wrapping around them like a net. The grounds clumped together and rose to the top in a soft mass. The crushed shell helped cut the acidity, and the yolk melted into the brew, giving it a smooth, rich texture that surprised anyone who dared to try it. This wasn't some backwoods joke. It was a real method, one that came from Scandinavian immigrants, passed down from grandfathers to sons, and then adapted by Depression-era families desperate to stretch every bit of flavor. You'd let the pot simmer, stirring once or twice, then slowly strain it through a dish towel or just ladle it out carefully. No filters, no gadgets, just a steady hand and a little know-how. What you got wasn't fancy, but it was better, darker, gentler on the stomach, and surprisingly good. A strange sort of earthy richness clung to every sip, mellowed by the egg, with none of that burnt bite. Some folks added a pinch of salt, others sweetened it with sorghum, sugar, or molasses, if they had any, but even plain, it warmed you from the inside out. One cup could carry a man through a whole morning of digging ditches, hanging laundry, or praying for rain. Kids were warned not to watch too closely. "That's grown-up magic," folks would joke, and in a way it was. "Did you really put an egg in that?" someone might ask, eyeing the cup suspiciously. "Sure did," you'd say with a grin, because it wasn't about wasting food, it was about chemistry, heritage, and holding on to something real when the rest of the world was falling apart. You see, when you lose your land, your job, your crops, you hang on tight to the little things, and sometimes that little thing was a cup of coffee that didn't taste like mud. Boiled egg coffee wasn't just a hack. It was a lesson in patience, thrift, and pride. You didn't need fancy machines or baristas, just hot water, old grounds, and one precious egg that pulled double duty. And maybe, just maybe, that's what made it taste so good. Because in a world where everything was being taken away, that warm mug in your hands meant something still belonged to you, even if it was just a strange, silky cup of coffee. Flour sack baking mix. When store-bought cake mixes didn't exist, and every grain of flour had to stretch a little farther, Depression-era families came up with their own version, and they kept it hidden in the cupboard inside a reused flour sack. You didn't have shelves lined with colorful boxes. What you had was a cloth sack filled with something far more precious. A homemade emergency mix, made from dry flour, a pinch of salt, a little sugar, and baking soda or powder, if you had it. Some folks even labeled the sack with a hand-stitched tag, for cake or biscuits only. Women would gather on weekends and make these in batches. Sometimes they used muslin or old apron fabric when the flour sack wore out. They'd measure dry ingredients by memory, no recipe books, just the feel of the scoop in their hand, and tie off each mix with twine, tucking handwritten instructions inside. Those little scraps of paper became family treasures. You'd pull one out on a Sunday morning or just before company arrived. Add water, maybe an egg if a neighbor had extras, or a spoonful of lard from the jar by the stove. Stir it in a dented tin bowl, then pour it into a buttered pan, or whatever baking dish hadn't cracked in the heat. And when that warm smell filled the house, sugar, flour, home, you remembered that it wasn't just about food, it was about pride. These pre-packed flour sack mixes were a sign of planning, care, and quiet wisdom. Kids thought it was magic. Open a sack, add a splash of something wet, and out came dinner rolls, biscuits, pancakes, or a simple depression cake. But you knew better. It wasn't magic. It was survival, pre-measured. Those sacks lived in bread boxes under the sink or hanging from hooks in the pantry. Some families traded them, bartering for eggs, fruit, or even a few hours of labor. "My mix for your carrots," someone would say, and deals were made over the back fence. Even after things got better, some grandmothers kept the habit. They'd smile and say, "Just in case," because they remembered when those little sacks meant the difference between dinner and nothing at all. And in the spring, when pantries thinned and gardens weren't quite ready, folks looked outside, at the weeds underfoot, and saw dinner growing wild. Garden weed salad. You didn't need a garden to eat fresh. You needed sharp eyes and a bit of courage, because during the Dust Bowl, dinner didn't always come from the market. It came from the lawn. You'd head outside with a tin bowl or a flour sack, past the broken fence, under the clothesline, in the spots where the grass was patchy. That's where the good stuff grew: chickweed, lamb's quarters, dandelion greens, purslane, names that sound like weeds to some folks today, but back then they were wild blessings, full of iron, calcium, and flavor, and best of all, they were free. Your mother taught you what to look for. This one has soft leaves. That one tastes peppery. Don't touch that. That's not food. You learned quick. A wrong pick meant a bad stomach. The right pick meant supper. Once you'd gathered a handful of each, you rinsed them in a bucket, shaking off the dirt and bugs. Then into the bowl they went, tossed with whatever you had: a drizzle of vinegar, a spoonful of bacon grease, or just salt and pepper. If there was leftover potato, crumbled bread, or a few chopped onions, all the better. The salad was sharp, clean, and strong, a mouthful of bitterness and bite, the kind of taste that reminded you it was real food, not filler. Some called it yard salad. Others just said, "We're eating weeds tonight." But everyone ate it. It wasn't just a side. It was proof that even when crops failed, the land still offered something. You just had to know where to look. Chickweed showed up early in spring. Dandelions came with the sun. Lamb's quarters lasted through heat. And purslane, oh, purslane grew in cracks, in driveways, between stones. The tougher the land, the stronger it thrived. Old-timers passed the knowledge down, like gospel. God made food that didn't need planting, they'd say. Just pick it before the chickens do. And maybe that's what survival looked like, walking outside, kneeling in the dust and gathering dinner leaf by leaf, weed by weed. Today, some of those same plants are sold in fancy markets under new names, but you know the truth. They were Dust Bowl greens, backyard supper, food that didn't come from a can, but from the strength of your own two hands, developing deep flavors that formed the foundation of the soup. The leeks were cleaned carefully to remove all dirt and sand, then sliced thin and cooked until they practically melted into the soup base. This slow cooking process was crucial for developing the sweet, complex flavors that made the soup special. The potatoes were crucial for creating the soup's creamy texture without any dairy products. The soup was created by a user's grandmother specifically as a cost-effective meal during the Depression, showing how families could create comfort food without expensive ingredients. The potatoes broke down partially during cooking, releasing starch that naturally thickened the soup and created a creamy, satisfying texture. The leeks provided subtle onion flavor that was more refined than regular onions, while the potatoes gave body and nutrition. We just walked through 30 kitchen miracles, not recipes from glossy cookbooks, but raw, honest survival. These weren't dishes born from luxury. They were born from grit, from grandmothers who could turn potato skins into broth, or a pile of dandelions into syrup, from kids who stirred vinegar into cleaning water and called it disinfectant, from men who sipped peanut shell coffee and called it just fine. If you felt something along the way, a memory, a scent, a voice you haven't heard in years, that's not by accident. That's legacy, because this wasn't just food. It was wisdom, survival, love disguised as boiled peels and bacon grease. You didn't just eat these meals, you carried them, you passed them down, and even if the world has changed, the lessons haven't. Waste nothing. Stretch everything. Feed with heart, not just ingredients. And now? Maybe you'll try one. Or just remember how good it felt to watch your mother save the day with nothing but a tin of lard and a wooden spoon. Maybe you'll teach your grandkids what hot bacon dressing smelled like when it hit cold lettuce. Or how vinegar wasn't just for salad. It kept your whole house safe. These stories are ours. They don't belong in a history book. They belong in the kitchen, in the conversations, in the comments down below. So tell me, which dish brought back the clearest memory? Which one made you smile? Which one made you tear up just a little? They are testimonies to the ingenuity of ordinary people who refuse to let hardship dim their humanity. In kitchens across the country, women like Margaret, Ruth, Alice, and Helen transformed scarcity into abundance, creating meals that nourished both body and spirit. They turned potato peels into soup, dandelion greens into dinner, and stale bread into dessert. Drop it in the comments. Let's build something together. A living recipe box full of truth, toughness, and taste.